Imagine waking up tomorrow and your heating doesn't work. No thermostat, no blanket from IKEA, no hot chocolate, no Uber Eats delivering something warm to your door, just you, the freezing cold, and the very real possibility that you might not make it to spring. Now imagine that's not a temporary inconvenience. That's just Tuesday for 10,000 years. That was the reality for our ancient ancestors. And the wild thing, they survived. We're talking about a period stretching back roughly 300,000 years, the era of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, but also including our older cousins, the Neanderthals, who were dealing with Ice Age conditions long before we showed up to ruin their neighborhood. And if you think modern winters in Scandinavia are tough, you have absolutely no idea what's coming. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, average global temperatures were about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, but that's the difference between a city like London being a bustling metropolis and being buried under a kilometer of solid ice. Large portions of North America, Europe, and Asia were covered by massive ice sheets that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Winters in the unglaciated regions where humans actually lived could plunge to temperatures we in the modern world, with all our gear and technology, would genuinely struggle to survive for more than a week. And yet the landscape was full of life. Woolly mammoths, cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions bigger than modern African lions, Irish elk with antlers spanning 3.7 meters. These animals weren't just scenery, they were simultaneously the greatest danger these people faced and the most critical resource keeping them alive. We'll get back to that. Sea levels were also about 120 meters lower than today, meaning land masses that are now separated by water were connected. Britain was attached to continental Europe. A vast, now submerged plain called Beringia connected Siberia and Alaska. The world map looked completely different, and ancient humans were walking across entire landscapes that are now under the ocean. This was the world. Cold, dangerous, breathtakingly different from anything we know, and full of people figuring out how to not die in it. So how exactly did they do it? Let's start with the obvious one, because it deserves far more credit than it usually gets. Fire. Humans have been controlling fire for somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million years, depending on which archaeological site you're referencing and how generous you're feeling with the evidence. The Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa shows traces of controlled fire use going back roughly a million years. By the time proper Ice Age winters became a serious survival challenge, fire wasn't a new technology. It was ancient, deeply understood, and absolutely central to everything human society was built on. But here's what most people underestimate about ancient fire. It wasn't just for warmth. Fire was a complete survival system, doing about 15 different jobs simultaneously. It cooked food, which made calories dramatically more bioavailable, meaning you extracted more usable energy out of the same amount of food. This is actually enormous. Cooked food is significantly easier to digest and delivers considerably more energy than the raw equivalent. Evolutionary biologist Richard Wrangham has argued compellingly that cooking is literally what allowed the human brain to grow as large as it did over evolutionary time. We basically traded gut tissue for brain tissue because cooking did the digestive work our guts no longer needed to do. Fire didn't just keep us warm. Fire made us smarter. Think about that next time you're using your oven. Fire also kept predators away during the long, dangerous nights. If you're camped in an Ice Age landscape and you're worried about a cave lion, an animal that weighed up to 300 kilograms and had absolutely no reason to be scared of you personally, a roaring fire is your most reliable bodyguard. Predators genuinely do not like fire. They back off. You sleep. You survive to see morning. Beyond that, fire hardened wooden tools and spear tips, making them more effective weapons. It provided light during winters where darkness lasted 16 hours a day, enabling social gathering, storytelling, knowledge transfer, and the kind of communal bonding that kept groups psychologically intact through months of confinement. It dried wet clothing, which in frozen conditions is the difference between comfort and hypothermia, and critically, it heated enclosed spaces, caves and shelters, to temperatures the human body could actually function in. The knowledge of fire maintenance and fire starting was itself one of the most valuable things a person in the Ice Age could possess. Losing your fire, having it go out in a blizzard with no way to restart it, was potentially a death sentence, which means firekeepers, people whose specific role was maintaining the communal flame, may have been among the most important members of early human groups. Not the biggest hunter, not the strongest warrior, the person who kept the fire going. If you think ancient humans just crawled into any convenient cave and called it home, you are about to be very pleasantly surprised. Yes, caves were used, and they were genuinely excellent natural shelters. A deep cave maintains a relatively stable internal temperature year-round, typically somewhere between 10 and 13 degrees Celsius, regardless of what's happening outside. In the middle of a glacial winter, that's not warm, but it is absolutely survivable, especially combined with fire and shared body heat. Cave walls also block wind, which in extreme cold is almost as dangerous as the temperature itself. Wind chill can push an already deadly temperature into the lethally dangerous territory within minutes. But caves weren't always conveniently located where people needed to be. Resources moved, animals migrated, people followed, and when there was no cave available, ancient humans didn't just sit in the snow and hope for the best. They built. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe and Asia shows caves that were used as shelters had sophisticated interior arrangements. Stone-lined fire pits positioned to maximize heat distribution, areas clearly designated for sleeping, separate zones for tool making and food preparation, even evidence of what appear to be storage areas. These people were organized. This wasn't an animal taking refuge in a hole. This was deliberate, planned use of space. This was interior design for survival. And then there are the mammoth bone houses. Yes, you read that correctly. In parts of Eastern Europe and Russia, modern-day Ukraine, the Czech Republic, and the Siberian plains, archaeologists have discovered circular structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones and tusks. The most famous examples come from the site of Mezhyrich in Ukraine, dating back roughly 15,000 years. These structures were constructed from hundreds of individual mammoth bones, femurs, shoulder blades, jaw bones, vertebrae, carefully interlocked and stacked to form walls. The frames were then covered with animal hides stretched tightly over the structure, creating a windproof, reasonably waterproof living space. Now think about what that required. These people did not have a hardware store. They did not have timber, nails, concrete, or any modern construction material whatsoever. What they had was an enormous dead mammoth, stone, and bone tools, and enough collective intelligence to figure out that if you arrange the curved bones like this, and brace the joints like that, and tie the tusks together overhead as a ridge beam, you get something that actually stays upright and keeps the wind out. Some of these bone structures required remains from over 150 individual mammoths. Whether those animals were actively hunted or primarily scavenged is still debated among archaeologists, but the scale of resource organization involved is simply staggering. The people building these homes weren't just collecting whatever was lying around. They were sourcing specific bones for specific structural purposes and transporting them to a chosen site. This is architecture. Prehistoric, bone-based architecture, but architecture nonetheless. Inside these structures, evidence of hearths, of decorated objects, of food processing suggests that these were genuine homes, not emergency shelters. Homes where people lived, cooked, made tools, raised children, and waited out the long northern winters together. Modern culture has a persistent obsession with the idea of individual survival, the lone hero, the solo adventurer, the person on the reality TV show who makes fire from 2 wet sticks and eats a beetle for the cameras while everyone else watches from their hotel room. Ancient humans were not doing that. They were doing the precise opposite, and it was absolutely intentional. Hunter-gatherer bands typically ranged from 20 to 50 individuals in a core group, with broader social networks connecting them to hundreds or even thousands of people across a wider territory. These weren't just social arrangements that happened to be convenient, they were carefully maintained survival infrastructure, and everyone knew it. In winter, when resources were scarce, travel was dangerous, and the margin for error was essentially zero. You needed specialists. You needed the person who knew exactly how to butcher a large animal to extract maximum caloric yield from every part of the carcass, including the organs, the marrow, and the fat deposits that most people would overlook. You needed the person who knew which plants still had nutritious roots under a meter of snow, and precisely where to dig for them. You needed the elder who could remember the winter 15 years ago when conditions were similarly terrible, and who knew which valley had still harbored deer when everywhere else was empty. You needed community, and these people built it deliberately, maintained it carefully, and understood that their individual survival was inseparable from the survival of the group. The winter months, when outdoor activity was necessarily limited, were likely the primary time for knowledge transfer. Stories told around the fire weren't entertainment, they were education. They were the accumulated survival knowledge of generations, packaged into narratives that could be remembered and passed on. The old woman who knew every plant in a 100-kilometer radius was not a burden on the group. She was a library. She was irreplaceable. Modern humans are, biologically speaking, naked apes. We have almost no body hair compared to other primates. In sub-zero temperatures without insulation, an unclothed human being loses body heat faster than they can generate it and dies of hypothermia within hours. The fact that we are sitting here today, and not just a footnote in the fossil record of some other species that kept its fur, is almost entirely because of clothing. Scientists have used a genuinely clever method to estimate when humans first started wearing clothes, studying the evolutionary divergence between head lice and body lice. Body Belly lice live in fabric and clothing rather than directly on skin, and they diverged as a separate species from head lice approximately 170,000 years ago. That's our earliest indication that humans were regularly covering themselves with something. But simple covering evolved rapidly into something far more sophisticated. By the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, the evidence for advanced clothing technology is extraordinary and, honestly, humbling. Bone needles recovered from sites across Europe and Siberia are so fine, so precisely crafted, that researchers attempting to replicate them using only period-appropriate tools have found it genuinely difficult. The eye of some of these needles is barely a millimeter in diameter. These were precision instruments requiring both exceptional craftsmanship to make and exceptional skill to use. The Sungir burial site in Russia, dating to approximately 34,000 years ago, provides the most vivid evidence we have of Ice Age clothing. 2 children found buried there were interred with thousands, literally thousands, of individually carved ivory beads that had been sewn into their garments. The painstaking reconstruction of those garments by researchers suggests a layered system, a close-fitting inner layer against the skin for moisture management, a middle insulating layer for warmth retention, and an outer layer of tougher hide for wind and water resistance, hoods, trousers, boots. This is, almost exactly, the layered clothing system recommended by modern outdoor survival and mountaineering guides. They arrived at this system 34,000 years ago through pure empirical trial and error. Generations of people who got it wrong died, and generations who got it right survived and passed on the knowledge. The hides themselves were processed through a technique called brain tanning, a labor-intensive method using the animal's own brain tissue mixed with water to chemically soften and preserve the hide. The result is genuinely impressive: supple, durable leather with reasonable waterproofing properties and good insulating qualities. Every large animal that was hunted provided not just food, but also raw material for clothing, footwear, blankets, tent covers, and carrying bags. The animal was used completely. Nothing was wasted, because in these conditions, nothing could afford to be. Here's something your body doesn't advertise clearly until you're already in serious trouble. Staying warm in genuinely cold conditions burns an enormous number of calories. Your basal metabolic rate in extreme cold can increase by 50% or more as your body desperately tries to maintain core temperature. If you're physically active on top of that, hunting, building, traveling, gathering firewood, the caloric demands become staggering. In an Ice Age winter, if you were not eating enough, you didn't gradually get tired, feel a bit chilly, and decide to take a nap. You became hypothermic, your thinking slowed, your coordination deteriorated, and you died, often quickly. The caloric math of winter survival was merciless, and ancient humans understood this at a gut level, even if they couldn't have articulated the biochemistry. This is why fat was the supreme currency of Ice Age nutrition, not protein, not carbohydrates, fat. Because fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient, more than twice the energy per gram of either protein or carbohydrate, and it's precisely what the body burns to generate heat. This is why large Ice Age megafauna were so critical to human survival. A mature woolly mammoth could weigh up to 6 tons. A significant proportion of that mass was fat, insulating fat deposits under the thick hide, fat marbling throughout the muscle tissue, and fat stored in the hump some individuals are believed to have carried. A single adult mammoth could theoretically provide somewhere in the region of 500,000 calories. That's enough to sustain a group of 25 people for several weeks. But hunting a mammoth was not a simple proposition. These were animals that could weigh 6 times more than a modern car, with tusks capable of impaling a human being, and the intelligence and social behavior to defend themselves effectively. The strategies used involved driving animals into boggy ground where they became stuck, ambushes at river crossings, and coordinated group hunts using fire and noise to direct panicked animals toward prepared kill sites. The planning, coordination, and collective expertise required for successful mammoth hunting represents an extraordinary level of cognitive and social organization. And then you had to deal with the food itself. How do you store 500,000 calories of meat when you have no refrigerator? You use the fact that the world is a refrigerator. Permafrost, permanently frozen ground that stays frozen year-round, was widespread across Ice Age Eurasia. Ancient humans dug food caches directly into the permafrost, using the natural deep freeze of the earth itself to store meat for weeks or months. This was not an accidental discovery. It was a deliberate, sophisticated food preservation strategy, and evidence of exactly this practice has been found at multiple Siberian and Eastern European archaeological sites. For food that couldn't be frozen in the ground, drying was the primary preservation method. Meat was sliced thin and dried over fires or in cold, dry winter air, reducing its water content content and dramatically extending its shelf life. Fat was rendered and stored in containers made from animal bladders or stomach linings. And in what may be the Ice Age equivalent of a modern energy bar, ancient humans appear to have made something very similar to pemmican, a mixture of dried, pulverized meat combined with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries that was calorie-dense, nutritionally complete, and could last months without spoiling. The autumn months before winter were not a time of rest. They were a time of frantic, organized, large-scale food preparation, hunting at maximum intensity, processing, drying, caching, the entire community working toward a single goal, having enough stored to survive until spring. Studies of storage pits and food caches at various archaeological sites suggest that these ancient communities were storing food quantities far in excess of immediate need, deliberately over-preparing as a buffer against the worst-case scenarios. This is not instinct. This is rational planning under uncertainty. This is humans thinking ahead. Not every ancient human community tried to tough out the winter in place. Some of them simply left. Evidence for seasonal migration in prehistoric human populations is widespread and compelling. Reindeer herds migrate hundreds of kilometers between summer and winter ranges. Bison herds do the same. Salmon runs are intensely seasonal, providing massive caloric windfalls at specific times and places. The human communities that depended on these resources were not going to stay put in a depleted northern landscape while everything edible moved somewhere else. In Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, patterns in the archaeological record suggest many groups spent summers in upland areas and moved to sheltered river valleys during winter. River valleys provided natural protection from the worst winds. Rivers provided water that, even in extreme cold, often had sections that didn't fully freeze. Valley bottoms also tended to accumulate game animals that similarly sought lower ground in winter, meaning that by moving into the valleys, humans and prey were converging in the same place at the same time. What makes these migration patterns particularly impressive is that they were clearly not improvised. Analysis of stone tools from various sites shows specific types of rock being transported over distances of hundreds of kilometers. There is only one explanation for this. These people were moving regularly between known locations along established routes, carrying materials from one place to another because they knew exactly where they were going and planned to come back. They had mental maps of landscapes spanning hundreds of kilometers. They knew the routes, they knew the seasonal patterns, they knew how long each journey would take and what they needed to carry. This was not wandering. This was strategic, annual movement based on accumulated generational knowledge of a vast and intimately understood landscape. We've talked about fire, shelter, clothing, food, and migration, but all of these things have one common root. They are all products of the same extraordinary capacity, the human ability to think about the future, model problems before they happen, and invent solutions to challenges we have never faced personally but can imagine. No other animal on Earth does this at anything approaching the human level. A bison in October does not think this winter will be particularly brutal. I should move south earlier than usual. A bear does not decide to cache extra food because it noticed signs suggesting a long winter ahead. An ancient human absolutely did both of these things, and then communicated the decision to the rest of the group in language complex enough to explain the reasoning and receive feedback. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, dating from roughly 40,000 to 17,000 years ago, are often discussed as evidence of art, of symbolic thinking, of spiritual life. All of that is probably true, but they are also potentially sophisticated visual databases. The animals depicted, horses, bison, mammoths, aurochs, reindeer, are portrayed with a striking attention to anatomical accuracy and behavioral detail. Some researchers have proposed that these paintings functioned partly as knowledge repositories, visual records of the animals in the local environment, their seasonal presence, their behavioral patterns, their physical characteristics, maintained and updated across generations. Art as survival technology, information storage on the most permanent medium available, rock walls. The psychological dimension of winter survival also cannot be dismissed. Long winters in confined spaces with limited food, under constant stress, with the knowledge that people in the group might not survive to see spring. This is a recipe for psychological collapse, social fragmentation, and the kind of internal conflict that could destroy a group faster than any blizzard. Ancient human communities appear to have understood this intuitively. The evidence for ritual, for shared ceremony, for music, bone flutes dating back 40,000 years have been found, suggests deliberate cultivation of group cohesion and psychological resilience. A group that maintains morale through the darkest months survives. A group that fragments does not. These were not people who were merely coping with their environment. They were actively managing it, managing the landscape through controlled burning, managing animal populations through selective hunting, managing their own psychology through culture and ritual. The human relationship with winter was not passive endurance. It was active, intelligent, collective problem solving at a scale and sophistication that we consistently underestimate. underestimate. We traded all of that for central heating, supermarkets, Gore-Tex jackets, and the ability to order soup from our phones at midnight, which is, on balance, a tremendous trade. No complaints.